Thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Taggart, and I'm here representing the North American Association for Environmental Education, working on the Global Environmental Education Partnership. I'm here today to serve as moderator for the session, Cataloguing Indigenous Knowledge. And I also want to welcome everyone who is here virtually through webcast, so welcome. And I want to thank the Eye on Earth Network as well for this wonderful conference and such a beautiful venue. So I am an environmental educator, and part of my job is to share effective practice and help build capacity for environmental education. So I'm really happy to be able to introduce this session as it represents such a critical piece of environmental education, which is the sharing of local knowledge and history as a way to help address these urgent environmental issues we're facing, like climate change.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here and share our story. I can tell our story. Cataloging Indigenous Knowledge is a kind of story which it is a part of our project, Indigenous Knowledge Bank. It's as if we have a bank and the knowledge is our money. I am happy to share this story with you today. The outline is the issue. We make some definition of the term indigenous knowledge, the context, our approach, and cataloging indigenous knowledge best practices. What does it mean? Opportunity with Paris Agreement. We have also SDGs, and we can share some results with Indigenous Knowledge Bank, but also with a new project, ET4CC, that we have with another partner, CTCN. Some achievement with both projects, lesson learned, and some perspective, if you allow me. The issue of cataloging indigenous knowledge is the difference between modern and traditional knowledge. As you know, indigenous knowledge is orally transmitted from generation to generation. But now I have experienced renewed interest from researchers and development actors. But there is a lack of connection, not strong analysis between the impact of climate change and the livelihood of communities. But you can find some studies about indigenous and how they use natural resources, but the deep analysis between climate change impact is sometimes missing. You hear sometimes maladaptation is a problem in developing country. And we think to have what we want, we have NAPA before now, before there is NAPA. And with NAPA, our countries make some proposal about modern infrastructure for adaptation and forget everything about indigenous knowledge. But as you know, our community must well their knowledge. It is what they must better. And when the event happen, we don't have some time to build infrastructure immediately or doing some initiative which can help communities. Because proposals they don't have. You cannot write proposal today and have money to build infrastructure today. There is also a lack of documentation which could facilitate the process. In our discussion with many people in GIEC in French, IPCC, at the beginning, they told it not easy to take account about indigenous knowledge. There is no documentation about indigenous knowledge. It is one of our motivation to go deeply and document indigenous knowledge. There is also no partnership between scientists and people working on indigenous knowledge or indigenous knowledge people. Lack of awareness that indigenous knowledge can contribute to local development strategy by taking account circumstances, local potential, experiences, and wisdom. Weak access of indigenous knowledge best practices information in the sphere of decision maker. That's why in their proposal, in NAPA and also in their document, they don't mention indigenous knowledge before. Yeah, just modern infrastructure, how to, but no anything. And in Africa, I think it's very important to take care about indigenous knowledge. I think it's important to make a definition of indigenous knowledge. Sometimes there is confusion. In the project Indigenous Knowledge Bank, the term indigenous knowledge is used in the broader sense to mean all knowledge that exists and develop in a community, locally and specifically. We don't want to just say indigenous knowledge is the knowledge belonging to indigenous people. Sometimes indigenous people is not if it is clear in English, it is not clear in French. Sometimes that can mean marginalized people and something like that. But in with what we are doing, indigenous knowledge is synonym of local, indigenous. We want to go deeply with the knowledge of community, not just marginalized people or something like that. We want to see broadly what happened. The Indigenous Knowledge Bank is built from ENDA experiences in climate change, vulnerability, impact, and adaptation. Desertification, as before, we have some project related to this aspect, this topic, sustainable development, desertification, and biodiversity, and so other projects related in poverty, etc. We want to build in this experience and valorize the vast reservoir of indigenous local knowledge and coping strategy that have helped Africa to engage with climate change over the time and space. The project has been developed by ENDA in partnership with UNITAR. It was from 2011 to 2014. It is the first project. We know some of local knowledge has been forgotten, hidden, or simply ignored. And through they have very valuable for mitigation and adaptation research effort to achieve sustainable social ecological development. Our approach is like standard approach we have in research. We develop a tool, guideline, or questionnaire, and make some consultation, multi-stakeholders consultation. We work with NGO, CBO, civil society organization, but also local community. But we couldn't go far without local community. And what we are doing is some interviews, focus group, submitting to gather knowledge from various ecosystems. We work in arid, semi-arid area, depending of the issue we find there. Document best practices, and also hold some workshop of validation, because we couldn't share it without doing some validation activities. What is new and central for the ENDA's Indigenous Knowledge Bank is that aim not only to collect knowledge, but usefully and strategically share, deploy such knowledge, and involve multi-stakeholders. We think to solve some issue I mentioned earlier, with decision maker, the problem of documentation, we have to share broadly to develop many tools which can reach different level of the community. Work at the grassroots, we we succeed to have a list of indigenous knowledge. What is important is not a list, but the content of the list and the work we do behind the list. Donc, sorry, francophone people. The content of the sheet with the questionnaire, we target some aspects in the questionnaire related to geographic area issue, the information of the practice, but we take a lot of picture. We have also some videos, some films of activities developed at the grassroots level. I think you can find many information of sustainability, the weakness of the practice, the possibility of replication, but also the costs. But why our decision making? They don't mention in their proposal our local knowledge. Some people think there is no cost. And it's possible we need to invest in indigenous knowledge. You can find all this information and the format look like this. The format we document the indigenous knowledge in the project Indigenous Knowledge Bank. And with this, we arrive to have a catalog of best practices in some countries. What is look like our database about indigenous knowledge with the first project with UNITA. We make also some publication. We target different level. This is the policymakers and all the research people. We have to make a lot of tools. We have to use a lot of tools, but also to have many ways of dissemination of the information. With our catalog also, we can try to make some link with SDGs. And what is common for all these best practices is the link with climate change. Climate change is something transversal to all these best indigenous knowledge, best practices. We can go one by one, but it will take time. You understand, when we use, for example, best practices related to land management and land degradation, there is the aspect of poverty also. You can see all the poverty also of all the aspect of education. Each SDG goal can be related with some best practices. It's just you don't want to take one by one, but if you understand the way we want to share with you this different type of linkage, I think we can expand. Some example of best practices. Uh, I think Zai is the practices most known in West Africa. I don't know, the part of Asia or also, but there is common best practices recognized in Zai, in Half-to-Moon, and other technologies. Uh, some examples, some picture. We have also a lot of video about indigenous knowledge. As in this first step, with this project, we were in Senegal, Benin, Burkina Faso, Gambia. Uh, uh, I think we do this country, and the other project help us to do more. I think we do a lot of advocacy, but Paris Agreement is is something very useful to recognize indigenous knowledge. Paris Agreement makes specific reference to the development and enhancement of indigenous capacity and technology. Paragraph 357B. And recognize the needs to strengthen knowledge, technology, practices, and effort of community and indigenous people related to address and response to climate change, and establish a platform for exchange of experience and sharing best practices. The idea of sharing is our advocacy for 3 years, and with Paris agreements, I think is a good thing. What we are doing, we have some result. There is also some positive point with SDGs, the document transforming our world, the Agenda 2050, 2030 for sustainable development, pledge that no one will left behind. It's it's a common word now for people working in sustainable development. It also is an opportunity for what we are doing in indigenous knowledge. People who are vulnerable must be empowered. It is also important to review the progress should draw contribution from indigenous knowledge. That means they take account about vulnerable people, what they are doing, their activity, how to support all this, to leave no one behind. Here are some results. I start to quote some country where we were during the project with UNITAR, Indigenous Knowledge Bank, Benin, Senegal. It's not enough, but it's just a project. We need to start something to document. It is what is important, not the mass of country where we were and the people involving in the process. But we need, as NGO, we don't have a lot of means to start something, to give away to others. After Paris Agreement, with Paris Agreement, other stakeholders who don't work before in indigenous knowledge start now to contact us, and they want to do something in indigenous knowledge. That's why we have this project promoting indigenous technology for climate change adaptation and mitigation. It is a project with CTCN. After the conference, after Paris conference, they have now the willing to do something. Before it is not possible for them to work on indigenous knowledge, this kind of, but with Paris Agreement, this document helps them to try something. Yeah, now they want to do something with ENDA about indigenous knowledge, but in the content we see other aspects like barrier, potential of technology deployment, the technology performance, and recommendation for dissemination. That means they want to put all this information, all this data in their platform. And in their platform, they have modern knowledge, and they want to add also some traditional or indigenous knowledge. That's why it is important for them to see the strength and the weakness, to compare, but also in French we say comparaison n'est pas raison. Each technology has its specificity, but I think it's a step. Yeah, it's a step for them to start working on indigenous knowledge. Here is the map. You already see it. We start with some countries, and with the new project we add three other, Ethiopia, Niger, and Chad. We have some achievement relating to multi-stakeholder consultation. We develop some partnership with the institution you see here. They are NGOs, there are research institute, its government, and also its civil society. Many stakeholders were involved. In terms of dissemination of information also, you see our web, we start something with internet. Before also, every time when we go to COP, we develop policy brief to share with policymakers, develop a lot of videos and something like to share in our place of exhibition. It is our way to advocacy. Some lesson learned also. Can I take 2 minutes more? Good. Yeah, we have learned about our project. And what is important is contribution of local knowledge to fight against poverty, but also there is a good contribution in sustainable development. Yeah, you cannot go without our local knowledge. In Africa, in the country targeted in our investigation, it is what community master, and when we don't have money, we use it. Yeah. Why, when we have money, we don't improve it? Yeah, I think it's a good way. Some perspective. We have some perspective with indigenous knowledge to target more countries. As you see, we are just in some little countries, and in a country we are in some locality, very small locality. But what is important is, as I say, to start something. Cataloging IP currently in use, or which has been used in the past, enable community to overcome difficulty fast, face it to local community at the international level. We need to promote more indigenous knowledge, develop capacity of community, and also with the new dynamic, with NDC, we have a role to play as NGO. With NAPS also, we have to do something to strengthen capacity of many stakeholders, not only decision makers, but also research people. We understand some people working, they don't want to hear indigenous knowledge. Is something who belong in the past. Yeah, no, we don't want to go. We have a future to manage while using traditional knowledge. There is a debate at the university about indigenous knowledge. Why going in a past? Yeah, it's not a way to improve things. We are here also to develop partnership with people who are here as we have the opportunity with SDG, with Paris Agreement to do something. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was really, really great. And it strikes me how fragile, but how important this information is, and just putting in the many stakeholders that you worked with to get to where you are, and how it has kind of expanded to some additional countries. I would argue that in addition to the SDGs that you spoke of, it also touches on SDG 4, education, which is a big part of what you're doing. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who's going to talk about kind of a complementary program that's also about sharing data and local knowledge. And this is Dr. Elena Uleva. She is a climate researcher and an educator. She received her PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Washington and has been a researcher at the University of California, where she lives now. For the last 20 years, she's been engaged in climate change analysis and prediction, and in the analysis of climate change impacts on global communities. Elena is the executive director of Community Commons, and she works also on the Global Forest Link project. Elena?
Hi, I want to switch to my presentation, I guess, but before we do this, if you just can. I want to thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Aby, for including me into this presentation, because I met Aby just through EOE a couple of weeks ago. And the thing is, it was our dream to introduce this component into the project that I'm going to talk about. But for my personal, wonderful, yes. From my personal experience, as Melissa mentioned, I've been in climate research for years, and we always were, and at some point I was involved in the seasonal climate prediction. And if we don't have a strong El Nino or La Nina, it's virtually impossible to make predictions like 3 or 6 months ahead. And we were always joking, but not joking, that Farmer's Almanac is the only true thing that can predict what is going to happen in the next year if we don't have the strong forcing. And for people who don't know what is Farmer's Almanac, it's the oldest tradition in the US for farmers that started somewhere at the end of 18th century. For people from Europe, Africa, and Asia, it's nothing, it's like yesterday, but for the US, it's like a long time ago. It's our indigenous knowledge. Yes. And here I want to talk about the education project that I'm a founder of and co-director of. The project is called Global Forest Link, and we are engaging youth from. Oh, can I go to the slide? What about this? We are engaging youth from all over the world in the collaborative analysis. That's fine, you can. In the collaborative analysis of the forests. And by forests, we mean forests and urban forests, but more it's environmental data. And the overall goal, the ultimate goal of the project is that students learn the what we call 21st century skills, but at the same time they interview experts and people from their communities to learn from them. And then at the end, they create stories that we call digital stories, which are either videos or presentation, we ask for narrated presentations, where they share what they learned, but also their stories contain the call for action. Because in most cases, what they observed, and they, what is going on? The presentation with its own voice. um, in most cases, what they observe is the degradation of the communities where they live, and they are trying to communicate the possible solutions or possibly just draw attention to what is going on. So how the project works. The students can join the project. Any group of students can join the project. We have the Global First Link portal, which has all the information and all the education materials that are needed, and everything is online. The students go to the nearest forests or parks and they collect data and they upload it, and by data I mean photos and forest surveys, and they upload there on the portal, and then we create then we put them into the special visual analysis tool called SWAF, where the data and images become available to the larger community. And we also connect this this data to the big data, to Earth observation data, to satellite images data, and allow everyone to analyze this data. And after this, the students analyze the data that they collected and all the peers all over the world collected, and as I mentioned, they interview the experts, and we help them to interview global experts. Basically, we have video conferences where students can ask all the questions they have. And at the end, they create the digital stories and share them with the slide shows these groups of students that we have, and the map of the locations. And we, by the beginning of this fall, we had more than 1,800 students from 100 schools from this country, US, Ecuador, Taiwan, Brazil, and Russia. And the icons show the locations of the school. And we're always looking for participants. How we really want to include students from Africa who will be able to interview people in their local communities and share the stories. The beauty of the stories, of sharing the stories in our portal, is that they can be parsed by keywords. You can find all the information that is there. You also can slice and dice, understand and understand the similarities. This is the video from the the students from San Diego, and this is the I have chosen this video from hundreds of the ones that we have because it actually talks about the Native Americans, but it's their perspective of this knowledge as a history. And what we are trying to do is basically to educate them to learn to think about this as additional piece of data that they can use and that everyone, like communities, can use.
Orange County South Interstate in Brooklyn, Brooklyn.
Yeah, information. The goal of our project is actually to promote the understanding that you really use these indigenous data as the so any social data that you would use. You parse it, you organize it, you analyze it, and link it to other data. And I'm sorry, my presentation didn't. Yeah, but that's fine. So I'm open for the questions.
I think we'll open it up for both Abby and Elena to field the questions from the audience, and also Bill will be managing the. I think you should. I will. Okay. Let me say this again so that our people remotely can hear me. We're going to open it now to questions from, and you can pose them to either Abby or Elena, and also Bill's going to be checking to see if we've gotten any from our remote guests. Nothing yet. Okay. Here.
Thank you. My name is Ekline Tawia from Southern African Research and Documentation Center. I'm quite interested in the Indigenous Knowledge initiative, and I wonder whether there is also an effort to collect data which is gender disaggregated, as we all know that there are different roles for both men and women, especially in indigenous knowledge systems. So it would be good to have that data gender disaggregated. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think gender issue is very important in indigenous knowledge. And what we are doing when we document indigenous knowledge, we make some separate focus group also with women and try to connect with them. But sometimes when they are with in group with men, you don't. It's difficult for them to share some relevant information. I think what we are doing also with the new project is to allocate an important part about gender issue. We go very deeply when we treat the information. I don't know if when we share it, perhaps it couldn't appear, or if we have just some minutes. It's difficult to understand what we are doing behind and also after this. But when we go to our website, perhaps you can capture more your sayings.
Thank you. Very nice presentations, both of you. My name is Judy Browse, and I'm from the North American Association for Environmental Education in Washington, D.C. And Aby, I wondered if you do training with conservation professionals to share this data on how it is used to actually inform practice on the ground. That was one question. And Elena had a question about, of all the work that you've done with students, what has surprised you the most in terms of what you've learned?
I will start probably. What surprised me the most, we work with students from different backgrounds. We are trying to make it easy to enter the project because all the tutorials, all the steps of the projects, all the parts of the project, they are designed in the way that you can adapt it to every situation, to every level. And for instance, in San Diego, we worked with students from very affluent communities, and then from the communities where 90% of the students in the school are from recent immigrant families. And what surprised me that actually there is no difference between the students except for knowledge of technology. And I think that this is the main divider right now, and this is something that we have to overcome. And when we talk to Aby on how we can engage youth from Africa in our project, which we are really keen to do, we really have to think of how we can provide not just like internet to everyone, but maybe just single cameras or tablets to students, which they don't cost anything now, but you just need to provide them, and they will learn how to use them immediately. And another thing is along the lines of the gender divide. We found that actually girls are more passionate than boys in trying to improve the world. So our project actually gains from women engagement because they really want not just to study something, but to really improve something. And I think this is when you're thinking about education gap in between the genders, I think you always have to think about the project learning and the project that actually call for action. Thank you.
Thank you. I think sometimes we put in capacity building everything. Training and other thing is capacity building. It is a part of the process. We start some training at local level, but also with some professional, not who are not really aware about climate change issue, how it works. I say we have the project with UNITAR. UNITAR is a training center of United Nations. That means training is a part of the process, but we will focus more on it in the next step. When we reach the agreement with CTCN.
Any questions from the internet?
I have to check with our person over here.
Okay, nothing yet,
Nothing's
okay.
come through?
Okay. Back here.
Good morning and thank you to our two panelists. I'm Roshan Jill Mamet from the Global Green Road Institute based here in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. I'm not a traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge expert. However, for a country with a very young population such as the UAE, I think it is important to understand that there's a common conception that when you talk about traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, once a country modernizes, they kind of forget about that. But here in the UAE, for example, they're still practicing that. However, how do we sustain that? My question to the panelists is that based on your experience, how do you think we can utilize modern technology, such as social media, so that the current generation who would carry on the sustainability of this indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, however we call it, would be sustained not only for this current generations, but for the generations to come. So if you can just shed some of your experience on the utilization of modern technology, like social media, that would be very important, and how we can possibly use it specifically for climate change adaptation, as we are very interested in that here in the UAE. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I can say also urbanization is a constraint of the development also of indigenous knowledge. We need to take care about the evolution, how to use social media, how to work to connect scientists with indigenous people. I think it's very important to use all modern things together and see how to improve indigenous knowledge. It is not the question to leave them there with their knowledge, with their traditional and local thing. The debate is how to link scientists and indigenous people to improve what we are doing. It is traditional, but there is some limitation. If you take a sheet of indigenous knowledge best practices, you can see a lot of limitation. This limitation is to involve scientists and other technician people to get together with them and try to improve the indigenous knowledge. It's not modern in this side, traditional in the other side. I think what is better is to put them together. Each of them can learn from others. It is, I think, what we think about indigenous knowledge. Not just leave it, it is indigenous knowledge, there is limitation. To make it sustainable, we need to look at what happened now and how to go with this.
I also think, like, if we start talking about social media, I think we have to engage youth as much as possible. Probably have some competitions, because in our digital story, final digital story, we have a competition when we have different rubrics, and one of the rubric is creativity. And we have so many really funny and interesting stories there. And I think if we really do this competition with the goal of trying to engage youth in preserving the community knowledge and convening it via their stories, this is one thing. They're much better than us in formulating this in, it used to be 140 characters. Now it's a little bit more, but I think this is like the new age. You cannot really do a paragraph, you have to do a tweet.
We have here a video about traditional way of forecasting. Perhaps we don't have time to show it, but in this video we involve scientists to say what they think about this way of forecasting, to comment what traditional people are doing. We have it, it's 15 minutes. It's something to read, not to listen. The voice is in French, there is transcription in English. If you have time, you can watch it, but if not, yeah, we can.
Yeah, so maybe over lunch we can. So we're going to take one more question, and I realize that this session is keeping you from, we're going to have lunch next, and I don't want to keep people from lunch. It's very important. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll have some closing comments.
I'm Veronica Ruiz. I'm working for the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Program Officer on nature-based solution. So mainly I'm promoting the use of ecosystem-based approaches for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And thank really both of you for this interesting session. And Aby, you mentioned that there is different issues. You mentioned there is a lack of integration of indigenous knowledge. There is also a lack of ownership for local communities. But what do you think could be is necessary to be done, or what is missing to address all those issues from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you. There is some step in my presentation. The advocacy we are doing, it is before Paris Agreement. In climate change, they don't take care about indigenous knowledge. And we think what is better to do is to document indigenous knowledge, to help the people of IPC sometimes to mention indigenous knowledge in what they are doing. It is what we are doing in the first project before Paris Agreement. But it's not just we have Paris Agreement is fine. We have to practice some aspect in what we are doing in our country. Sometime in many documents you couldn't find any word of indigenous knowledge, and it is what our community master the best. If you bring modern technology, you have to train them. It is not the case when you use traditional thing. The children grow up with seeing his parents doing some kind of activities. But I think with the luck, everybody have to do. It is not only the role of NGO. The research have a part to play, civil society, decision maker. We have to let them more aware of the role of indigenous knowledge, but also about the ownership. Sometimes when you don't support indigenous people, after they feel alone and they don't have support. It is not a good way, I think, to fill this gap. Yeah.
So, thank you very much. I just wanted to make a brief comment, I think appropriate for the session. America and the regional focus here and the Gulf area, very important. But when you're talking about climate change and indigenous knowledge, you have to remember Asia, Oceania as one of the places where there's the highest impact and the very real interest and effort to apply indigenous knowledge to the solutions for those small island developing states and otherwise. So again, just a brief mention that I thought ought to be included here in this session, so thank you.